Welcome to the show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This show today is sponsored by our friends over at Sweet and Savory. If you're looking for a great Valentine's destination and you're looking for a little bit of money off a great experience, you need to go to sweetandsavoryclassroom.com and use the promo code IndieThinker when you check out. Now, every single news story these days seems to spawn about 1 billion different conspiracy theories, and of course, that's probably in order, given the fact that we cannot trust the mainstream media.
I've been on a plane with 2 female pilots and say, wow, this is gonna go fast.
But it's also important to remember that you have been lied to about many things, but you haven't been lied to necessarily about everything. So when we see a helicopter crash with a commercial airliner, it's not odd for us to launch 1 billion different ideas about what actually took place here. I've seen things like people talking about remote controls and maybe some nefarious force trying to hijack this helicopter and run it into the commercial airliner. I've also heard that this helicopter had 3 near misses, as though somebody was kind of on this death mission to try to crash this helicopter. I don't know that any of that is true. And then, of course, I've heard a whole bunch of different ATC, air traffic control recordings that I'm not even sure were actually from this crash. All of that has been circulating online. And like most things, I do believe that there's a simple explanation for what took place in this helicopter crash. I'm going to try to offer it as, I guess, a solution, but more importantly, as a return to a simple precept that we need to start thinking about and really engage with if we're actually going to function as a society. But first, let me read one of the stories to you that has come out now since this helicopter crash has taken place and that the pilot for the helicopter has been revealed, as it was done so just this weekend. This article from USA Today says this: the crash, among the worst aviation disasters in modern history, left no survivors. The Army identified those killed alongside Lowback in the helicopter as Staff Sergeant Ryan Austin O'Hara, 28, of Lilburn, Georgia, and Andrew Lloyd Eves, a 39-year-old chief warrant officer from Great Mills, Maryland. Lowback, a 28-year-old aviation officer assigned to the 12th Aviation Battalion, was the only female pilot on the flight. In an unusual move, the Army granted her family's request to hold her name before it was released on Saturday evening. It came after President Donald Trump, with little explanation, pointed the finger at DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, as a factor behind the crash. Not only did she deserve what she achieved, she was overqualified most of the time for what she was able to accomplish, said Captain Bilal Kordab, who recruited Lowback to the North Carolina National Guard. Nothing was just handed to her. She was commissioned as an active duty aviation officer months later. She quickly skyrocketed through the ranks and latched onto piloting like a bird to air. Lowback graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a degree in biology in 2019. A distinguished military graduate, she was in the top 20% of cadets in the nation, according to the Army. Now, there's a couple things to mention from what we just read. First of all, the report of this woman being such a glowing cadet and being such an amazing pilot seems really odd. It seems a little bit like Cope, right? Because she's also responsible for the greatest aviation disaster in American history. We'll get back to why she was responsible in just a moment, but let's just take a moment to acknowledge the fact that she is responsible. Now, the media is loath to admit this to you, but she was the pilot of this helicopter. It even slightly kind of suggests this in the report we just read, but never comes right out and says it when we see that the DoD withheld info about her to the public. Now, that seems odd. You might say, well, that's because the family wanted to protect their loved one, but that's fine if this is an individual choice and doesn't impact the lives of the 64 other people on this commercial airliner. Then we have an obligation and a right to know what took place, and the families of those who perished in the commercial airliner have a right to have this kind of information revealed to them rather than held back. All that to say that we see in the Telegraph a not so, I would say, overt admission of the fact that she was the pilot right here. She was being overseen by Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Lloyd Eves, who had more than 1,000 hours of flying experience and would have been expected to take over the controls in the event of an emergency. So the idea here is, yeah, Loback was definitely flying this helicopter, but if there was an emergency, this guy would have taken over. But of course, there wasn't an emergency before they ran headlong into a commercial airliner. So it was most assuredly Loback who was flying. And of course, withholding the information actually only proves this further, because it was initially reported that the name of the pilot would not be revealed. And the other two officers that were in the helicopter were revealed, and only this third person's name wasn't revealed until just this past weekend, and now we know that the third person is Rachel Loback. Now, why was her name withheld? Well, if you don't want people to posit that it is possibly DEI issues, then you should come right out and say that, instead of what actually took place, which is that they withheld her name, her social media accounts were scrubbed, and then they finally revealed her name. But of course, the internet sleuths out there that don't miss a beat were quick to show us two things that I think are of importance. And the first one is this, is that Loback was somebody who at least supported, if not was within, the LGBTQ community. And second of all, she worked with, in the last 2 years, the Biden administration. So this perfectly insinuates what people have been saying online, that this must have something to do with DEI. When you have a pride-waving Biden lackey, what else can we infer, especially when you want to try to hide that information from us? But I'll just go one step further and say that I'm not entirely sure that this is a DEI-related crash. I don't think that just because you're gay somehow that it impairs your flying ability. At least I have never known that to be an issue with homosexuality. There's plenty of moral arguments against it, but never have I heard that it impacts your flying ability. And even though, and this is one of the few cheeky things I'll say, women have a troubled kind of history with parallel parking, nor does it mean that just because she's a woman, she can't fly a helicopter. But again, if the military and the government didn't want us to try to make those kind of associations, that information should have been released to us immediately. But I think rather there's a more logical explanation, and one that is actually more soul-fulfilling, and one that is way more helpful. And that is the idea of original sin, that all of us are tainted with a fallen nature. And even the idea of human depravity, which is that even the good that we would do is tainted because of our original sin and because of our fallen nature with a bit of evil. So even the good that we would do has a bit of evil involved with it. Now, this idea I think is super helpful. If DEI was involved, the reason DEI is so bad and so evil is because it inevitably puts people in positions that don't necessarily deserve those positions. This is the idea with DEI. Of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That we're going to include people based upon diversity quotas rather than their competency. But the reality is the best way to hire, regardless of any of the diversity quota stuff, is just simply to choose the person who is best skilled for the job. That's it, regardless of their skin color. Now, why is that so important? The reason for that is because we are fallen creatures. When you hire somebody because of a diversity quota rather than their competency, you are leaning into the fallen nature of humanity. And that inevitably is going to come back and bite you in the face. In fact, there are atheists galore who will tell you that the doctrine of original sin and total depravity are debilitating doctrines. And that's a horrible way to view anthropology, to look at people. You shouldn't view people as fallen sinners who desperately need a savior.
I can't tell you how many Christians I've talked to who said we are worthless, we are disgusting sinners, and we need Jesus to save us. This doctrine of depravity, what a horrible basis for a civilization.
The problem with that is that it actually isn't a debilitating doctrine. It's actually a life-giving doctrine, a life-giving idea. Because if we understand that humans are fallen, we can then develop institutions and we can develop systems that mitigate and militate against that rather than lean into our incompetence. If that incompetence is leaned into, it is going to eventually bite you in the butt, as it may have done here. But again, I don't think it's just simply DEI, but I do believe that it is human nature. We are fallen and often incompetent, and mistakes like this happen all the time. Wild suggestion here, but perhaps a group of people doing military exercises at night, wearing night vision goggles over some of the most crowded airspace in America is not a great idea. See, I think we want to try to involve conspiracy because very often we need explanations. And sometimes the simplest explanation is the best. And that is that human beings are simply fallen and incompetent. So I don't think we should use DEI as a scapegoat. That will, if we're not careful, become the right's version of systemic racism. It will become the right's black square if everything is DEI and we don't get back to a simple idea. And that is human depravity is the problem. And once we figure out what the problem is, we can start looking for solutions. And the only solution that I know of for fallen humanity is a rightly ordered understanding of human nature. So in either case, whether it is simply another aspect of DEI gone awry or just simply that mankind is fallen, when you realize that, you can finally get to the place where you look for divine help, and that will help all of us because we know deep down, we all really need it. All right, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to check out our sponsors down below. And if this show was meaningful to you, you can get this and so much more content, including ebooks, audiobooks, and films by becoming a member over at indieThinker.org/support. But of course, most importantly, don't forget to go with God.